I thank God every day, Herle Burlyites, that I have this podcast with as loyal a following as we do, and that it lets me stay connected with all of you during this pandemic. I love your comments and questions back to us on the socials, and even the more private messages I personally get, most of which, and I thank you for your discretion, do not include weird photos. I joke around a lot on here, but it really does mean a lot to me. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is working hard to keep Canadians connected to what matters most. Never more important than during COVID-19. And here's just one lovely story among many. Christina Ferreira is a registered nurse at the Leukemia Bone Marrow Transplant Unit at Vancouver General Hospital. Working right on the front line, she was witness to just how traumatic it was for patients who couldn't visit with their families due to COVID restrictions. So Christina talked to her boyfriend, Matthew Joyner, about it. Matthew's a TELUS employee. He went straight to his manager and secured $1,500 worth of tablets for Christina's patients. Just like that. The most rewarding part for Matthew? Hearing the stories from Christina about how emotional her patients became when they video called their loved ones. Stories like this are happening right across the country because TELUS believes it's more important than ever to hashtag stay strong, stay connected. I urge you Herle Burlyites to check out that hashtag. It's really quite touching. As well as to visit telus.com/stay connected to learn more. All right, you Herle Burlyites, let's get this pandemic podcast underway. We thought of bringing this episode to you from Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto because, hey, it'd be cool to have a huge live audience for the show, but decided that the Herle Burly has to set a good example and obey all proper physical distancing protocols. So Zoom it shall continue to be. We have another pod in 2 parts for you today because a few weeks ago we haphazardly thought, why not make the show twice as long during the lockdown with twice as much swearing? And for some ungodly reason, it all appears to be working. First up, we have Cathal Kelly. Not only is Cathal the hugely admired sports columnist from the Globe and Mail, he's also the recipient of the 2019 Stephen Leacock Medal for Humour for his childhood memoir, Boy Wonders. We're going to talk with him about sport and business in the time of COVID, how the NBA made the pandemic real for most people, what the hell are games going to look like when we get them back again, and what kind of pictures does Mark Bergevin have on Jeff Molson. For the second part of the pod, we'll bring in our political panel, Scott Reid and Jenni Byrne. They'll pick up on that conversation, and we'll continue to spar over differing points of view on how we open the economy, what it's like to lose an election, and should question period be back in operation. Welcome to the show, Cathal Kelly. Great to have you here. Let's start if we could, because I just have to get this out of the way. I'm somebody, my last name, Herle, spelled Herle. I have spent my whole life with people either knowing how to say my name and spelling it wrong, or knowing how to spell it and saying it wrong. So I believe that when we first talked last week, I called you Cathal Kelly, and then I spent the weekend debating people how to say your name. So it is Cathal Kelly. There we go. So
it's Cathal.
For people, Cathal, right. So for people who read the Globe and Mail and don't know who I'm talking to, I am talking to the sports columnist for the Globe and Mail, whose name is spelled Cathal and is Cathal. How are you?
That's it. Good. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you managing your way through this lockdown period? Must be strange for you. You're probably used to doing a lot of traveling and.
Well, there's not as much traveling as there used to be. I got to say, this hermetic lifestyle suits me. This is pretty much how I lived before, but professionally, it's been a bit of a dry zone. So yeah, I'd like them to get back at it, to be honest.
Are you having trouble thinking about things to write about? Because I'm literally not following sports at all anymore, and I'm a fanatic. So if I had to write a daily column, I don't know what it would be about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have the same trouble. The exact same trouble. Like, it's really not about anything at this point. It's just meandering. Yeah.
Right.
It's become the Seinfeld of sports columns.
Just a little bit of background. You don't look like you're an ex-jock. How did you get into this business? Let me just say that as near as I can understand what you do, which is watching sports, hanging around with athletes and coaches, and then writing about sports, this is not a job. Okay?
No, not really.
This is what the rest of us do in our spare time.
Yes.
How do you get a job like that?
I know. It's incredible, isn't it? Especially a Muppet like me. I fell backwards into this. I wasn't one of those people. I was always a fan, but it was not my goal to become a sports journalist. That's something I fell backwards into. You know, you could go through a long story, but it's a series of people you meet through your journalism. And I hesitate to even use that word. It makes me sound like a pediatrician or something that's a real job. My journalism career, I met a few different people and eventually got an opportunity to start writing about soccer. And at a time when there were still opportunities in the print side of the business, there were still openings, people coming and going. I happened to fall perfectly into one of those and ended up writing baseball for a living. So that it was a progression from there. But it's mostly blind luck, quite honestly.
When you started writing about baseball, were you a baseball expert?
I would not say so. No, I would not say so at all. The story I like to tell about baseball is on my first day, I went down to spring training. So they just kind of throw you into it. So I went down to spring training and I was sent there with Richard Griffin, formerly the Star's amazing baseball columnist. And Griff was told to take care of me. So I showed up the first day, and how it works, first day of spring training, the players are just out in the field. Nothing's very organized. They're shagging flies. There's hundreds of them, it seems like, because all the minor leaguers are there with them. So you're standing at the side, like it's not really a professional field. So you're just standing at the sidelines watching them. And I was going over Griff. I was nervous. And I said to Griff, what do you think I should do today? And Griff's like, well, I'm doing hitting. Maybe you do something on pitching. And I said, okay, great. Who should I talk to about that? And Griff said, well, Griff, of course, assumes I know some things. I know nothing. I said, who should I talk to about that? He goes, well, I don't know. You might start with the pitching coach. And I said, great. Who's he? And Griff's like, names him. And then he says, and I said, which one is he? And Griff points at him. And he's standing in the middle of the field, like center field roughly, talking to a few players, standing with them as they shag flies. He goes, you should talk to him. And Griff then made the terrible mistake of turning his back on me, at which point I just walked out onto the field. And it's like the Doc Graham moment in Field of Dreams. You know, when he crosses the path and all the players turn and stare, he crosses over the foul line. I did that. You're not allowed. As a reporter, you are not allowed on the field of play under any circumstances. And so I had just walked into the field of play while people were hitting. And of course, having done it, I couldn't stop. And you can imagine from about third base to deep center field how long a walk that is. So I had to do it with complete silence and every eye on me. And I got up to the pitching coach, Brad Arnsberg, who's a lovely guy. And I said, hi, Mr. Arnsberg, my name's Cathal Kelly. I'm a reporter. I'd like to talk to you. And he said, sure, you can't be here. And I said, yes, absolutely. And turned around and did this horrendous walk of shame back off the field, a second leg of my walk of shame. So yeah, that's how much I knew about baseball when I started baseball.
Well, you mentioned the word journalism. And
yes.
last week we had Bob Fife on the show.
Yeah, the Great White Shark.
Talk about what he does. And one of the things we talked about is that he is known as somebody who doesn't protect people, who doesn't play favorites, and if he knows something that is newsy, he will write it, regardless of the consequences to you or to anybody else. It's not really the business you're in, is it?
Not really, because I mean, in sports, there's always a question of the things you think you know and the things you provably know. And so you only want to write the things you provably know. Those things are hard to get at. Like, I mean, there is, in politics, of course, you have like politics actually is a lot like sports in many ways, I think, to cover it. It's different teams competing, different interests. But I think sports is more clubby and cliquey and more self-protective. And over the years, they've gotten more frightened of letting information out. And quite rightly, why would they? So, that is more about
upper body injuries.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, why would they tell you? What is the percentage for them? And they've honed the business. It's actually rather like politics. Like, I mean, the stories come through a few people, and that is their entire job is leaking those player X to team Y. The Bob McKenzie's of the world, that's what they do. They go ferret out that information. And other people it's bizarrely kind of freed other people to not have to do that because there are a few concentrated players who disseminate all the information.
And what is the tension between informing your audience and the supportive nature of sports journalism, the boosterish aspect of sports journalism?
Some people may. I don't.
No.
I was for me, there's no tension. I assume for some people there are. I don't live on cooperation. That's not my. That's different ways to come at this from a writerly perspective. That's not my perspective. I don't need them to tell me things. So no, there's no tension for me. I imagine there is some tension for other people. I don't really think of myself as I shouldn't say that's not true. I was going to say I don't think of myself as a sports writer. Of course, I'm a sports writer, but it happens to be the subject I write about. I'm not promoting anything here. The teams are going to do fine without me. They don't need me to help them. So I try to approach it as a bit of fun, to be quite honest. Like it's not a terribly serious topic. I get that many people take it seriously, but it's something you can have a great deal of fun with. Like, people like Bob or Steve Chase are in a different boat because the things they are reporting on have concrete effects on the real lives of all Canadians. So the things they're talking about actually matter. The things I'm talking about are fun.
Well, they've not been fun during this pandemic because they're gone. And in fact, we were talking just the other day, David Rosenberg and some of us on the Air Quotes media team that put this thing together, about how the Raptors, the NBA announcing that the season was canceled.
Yeah.
Really signaled for many people, especially in Toronto, the beginning of the pandemic, that this was serious. This was, oh my God, right?
Yeah.
This isn't Wuhan, China. The Raptors are over.
Yeah.
How have we missed it? Like 2 months has gone by, 3 months almost with no sports. We would normally have had hockey and NBA playoffs in this period of time, in the beginning of the Major League Baseball season.
Yeah.
World seems to be spinning on its axis, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And I take your point exactly. I don't know how, I guess we all saw it coming. It seemed very far away when it was Wuhan being locked down. But as soon as they locked down Milan, that seemed a different level of it. That seemed a lot closer. And I suppose we all knew, or at least, I should have known, that things were coming to a head here. But it wasn't until that moment. It wasn't when they canceled the NBA season for me exactly. It was the next day, as we were waiting to see if all the rest of the leagues would do it. And I remember sitting in a bar, I think 5 days before that, with a couple other sports journos and taking a bet about whether they would cancel the NHL season. And the other guy, who knows a great deal, laughed at me when I suggested they would cancel the season over this. And then to sit there the next day and watch that rolling series of leagues cancel, I think for a lot of people, even people who don't care about sports, that was the beginning of it. And then by the next Monday, it was all done. Like, it just felt like everything had been shut. So yeah, I think in some ways, since sports started this, sports is going to be the one, not a vaccine will end it, but that's going to make people feel as if they're getting back to some sense of normalcy will be when sports starts up again.
And we're going to stadiums or arenas to watch it.
I still think even if they don't, let's face what, we talk about this thing as if it's going to end, as if it is finite, as if, there's going to be, someone pointed out to me the other day, they keep saying about a vaccine, 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months from when? Shouldn't it be 10 to 16 months by now? But they keep saying 12 to 18. And there's a truth to that. This may never.
And there may never be one. There may never be one.
So we may have to face a world in which this is the new reality. And I don't know what that means exactly, but if that is, then sports changes too. So sports will change entirely. I'm not sure what that looks like. I have some ideas, but we don't know what the next step is. So I think when sports starts, whether that's with fans or without fans, people will start to feel like things have returned to normal in some way.
Do you think it will help? Like, I presume that a lot of people, and it could be me, but I can't self-assess, but I presume that a lot of people are going through a lot of what might be described as mental health issues right now, about being cloistered in and being locked away from, and the loss of, listen, we've both been around a lot of men in our lives, and if you take away sports, there's not a lot men talk about. So will it help to have sports back? Will it help the general mood and disposition and humanity of this period of time?
You know, I think about this a lot. Like, I mean, what makes sports wonderful is I think it's the last uniculture. It's the last monoculture. It's the last thing we all have in common, which is not to say that everybody loves sports. But when the Toronto Raptors are in the playoffs and winning, everybody in the city of Toronto feels like they're in it together. There's nothing else like that in our culture. So I think it does serve an incredibly important social function. I think it will give people something to, you know, even if you don't really care about it, doesn't everybody love the hum of a July baseball game on the radio while they're puttering around the house? Like, these things are the sounds of normalcy. And, you know, it will give people a goddamn chance to get off CBC and CNN, you know, this kind of tiresome wheel of non-information and incremental change. I think it will give people something to think about that isn't real life, which at the moment seems, you know, pretty heavy.
Okay, so both the NBA and the NHL are talking about having some sort of playoff system to end their truncated year. Major League Baseball is supposed to be starting. NFL starts sometime in the late summer. CFL's already canceled the beginning of its season. What is the first game we're going to see? What's the first sport that's going to play a game?
Okay, if we take for granted that, you know, soccer has come back in some places, but you're talking North America, I'm going to put my money on the NBA, if only because the NBA seems to be the league in which the players and the owners and management are all on the same page and want to get back together. So that, I think they're the most highly motivated to get it figured out. I think the NHL is just slightly behind them, but it could be like neck and neck. It just depends on how long. And I also think the NHL is going to take a lot longer for those players to get back in shape, because skating is different from running. And presumably none of them, or very, very few of them, have skated in 2.5 months. So, yeah, I would say the NBA would be the first.
That should level things for the Canadiens a little bit.
Yeah, well, you got Carey Price. I mean, anything's possible. Anything is possible.
Yeah. He's never ever done that in the playoffs, you know. He's never ever done that in the playoffs. If you were talking to me about Ken Dryden or Patrick Roy, I would say, yeah, they can steal a playoff for you, but he's never stolen a playoff for anybody.
No, but I mean, wouldn't this be a wonderful moment to do it? Like, I mean, he's never going to have a better chance.
That is for sure. They may not make the playoffs again in his tenure. So, yes, it would be a wonderful story if he were to do it, because he's a wonderful guy and he's a tremendous goalie. But he hasn't had that playoff performance that we're talking about, where he carried a team.
Yeah.
You don't want to. You see, I'm in the habit of pissing off. I'm a diehard Montreal Canadiens fan, but I'm in the habit of pissing them off sometimes. I have this story where I was introduced at a golf tournament to Serge Savard, who is one of the greatest players in the history of the National Hockey League and a great general manager through the 80s for the Montreal Canadiens. They won 2 cups. I was introduced to him at a golf tournament. And
I'm still stuck on one of the greatest players in the history of the NHL. I was a great player. No, okay. But yeah, sure.
Well, he's a Hall of Famer.
He's absolutely. Don't they let just about anybody into the Hall of Fame these days?
He broke his leg twice, and he's still a Hall of Famer.
Absolutely. I'm just getting at
Listen, you're going at Serge worse than I am. So I meet Serge at this golf tournament, and he's introduced to me, and he starts to wail on me about politics. And he says that I ruined everything about Paul Martin and Paul Martin's government, that he's talked to a lot of people, and I'm the person that was responsible for the fact that the Gomery inquiry was called into the sponsorship affair, and that caused the defeat of the government, and I ruined everything. And he's going on, and he's Serge. He's got the cigar. He's got the scotch. He's holding court. People at this tournament are starting to gather around the table. And I'm with my idol. So I'm being super deferential, unlike my normal self. And I'm being apologetic and trying to explain, but he's beating the shit out of me. And finally, I lose my patience. And I say to him, when we are done talking about the Gomery inquiry, can we talk about the Chelios trade? And Sir Savard looks at me and he says, "Go fuck yourself." And that was the end. So I've got his picture hanging up behind me on the wall here.
Yeah, they're like that. But they become contemplative and fun at the end. Like that, you would not really have that conversation in the midst of their career. Certainly not now.
No, but they're all so different now than they were. At these golf tournaments, you run into old timers who played for $100,000 or less and partied their asses off while they were on the road, and they're totally different animals than these people that make $7-8 million a year. And
it's not a lot of fun to be had anymore.
Since we're on the Montreal Canadiens, I don't want to dwell on this, but I do need to draw on your expertise.
Oh,
right?
whoa, okay,
Okay. They've been you're the sports writer for Canada's national newspaper, Cathal.
Yeah,
I presume that you have some interest in sports outside of the city of Toronto.
Absolutely, but I have never claimed any expertise on anything. But let's just put that out there. Because if I did have expertise, I'd be making a lot more money working for a team. But anyway,
everybody who follows hockey seems to think that in a normal circumstance, the Montreal Canadiens would replace Marc Bergevin as their general manager. He's been there for a long time, and they are a worse team than when he started. And they show no path toward being a good team. No. What is the relationship between him and the owner, Jeff Molson, that he is secure in that job?
Clearly, it's a good one. Well, think about it this way. If you own a sports team and you like the general manager and you like dealing with him and you like talking to him, and perhaps he doesn't talk to you like an idiot, and maybe he calls you up before he does things and makes you feel you're still making money. It's a business. The Montreal Canadiens are not going to make substantially more money because they're winning. I mean, that's the great falsehood of sports. People say, once we're winning, we're going to make all this money. You're making boatloads of cash. Win, lose, or draw. I'm assuming that just about the most profitable team in baseball is the Miami Marlins. I mean, who steady lose, but because their salary cap is so low and their transfer payments are so high, they're making a ton of cash. So if you come at this from a purely business perspective, which perhaps the Molsons do, and they like Marc Bergevin, why would they change him? That's not based on any expertise. That's just based on any inside knowledge. I'm just assuming that must be the case because you're right. The team is a dumpster fire and has been for years, and they are wasting the prime of one of the greatest goaltenders of all time.
Absolutely, but that kind of an owner shouldn't be in the league. If I'm wrong, tell me. But I think this is the reason that the NFL does not allow corporate owners. You have to be an individual to own an NFL team. And it's because they want passionate people who want to win championships owning their teams, not companies who are looking for a solid rate of return on their quarterly results. That's the difference between Jerry Jones and MLSE, isn't it?
Well, I mean, MLSE, I would suggest at this point is doing a lot better job than Jerry Jones, based on their track record recently. I mean, Jerry Jones been a long time. He's pretty passionate. It's not quite worked out, has it? I don't think there's any one recipe. I think you are correct in saying that an individual owner is a much better circumstance for any sports team than a corporate owner, because the corporation is just going to think about profits, as it should. That's why it's a corporation. But the individual owner can also, I mean, we know plenty of, both you and I could list, I'm sure, 10 off the top of our head, of individual owners who've actually absolutely pooched their teams because they can't stay out of them. James Dolan the New York Knicks would be a perfect example. That should be a winning franchise all the time. But because he keeps sticking his big thumb in, he's ruined that franchise. So I don't know if there's there used to be a thing they would say about MLSE, who owned the Leafs and the Raptors. They didn't want to win. And that's simply not true. Everybody wants to win. They
didn't care enough.
What they did, obviously for them, they wanted people off their necks. And I'm sure the same is true of the Molsons. But that may be that's got to have something to do with a personal relationship that somebody feels that guy's just, they can talk to him, they like him, they believe his vision, and maybe he sold them just a bag of goods, but clearly someone believes in his vision.
Well, personal note to Jeff Molson, you are in charge of a sacred trust and you are pissing it away. So get your shit together.
But I would also analogize, as someone who covers the Leafs on a regular basis, I try to use the Chicago Cubs example. I mean, was there a more passionate fan base in all of sports 5 years ago than the Chicago Cubs fan base, and that is entirely based on disappointment. Years and years of accrued disappointment has pushed that team into such a central place in its city, its mythology. Then the Chicago Cubs go and win the World Series. Does anybody talk about the Chicago Cubs anymore? Does anybody talk about the Cubbies, Ernie Banks? And nobody cares because they won. Winning is sometimes the worst thing you can do unless you're willing to continue, unless you're the New England Patriots. Winning once ruins everything. I'm telling you, the Toronto Maple Leafs, I guarantee this, as soon as they win a Stanley Cup, no one will talk about the Toronto Maple Leafs in this town anymore. At least the volume will go way down once we've crossed that bridge. And I said this to Brendan Shanahan. I said, the perfect thing for you is a steady rise that gets you to the finals and then you lose. That's the ultimate thing in Toronto. Winning, I think, is a bit of a dodgy business proposition.
Well, ironically, you should say that because winning the Grey Cup after some 30 years of not being able to finished off the Toronto Argonauts in this city.
Yeah.
As soon as they won the Grey Cup, people stopped being interested in them.
Yeah.
Now, there's other factors involved, but again, the break of that streak of there are different reasons why people get attached to sports franchises, I guess. And in Montreal's case, it was about winning. That franchise is supposed to win. There's nothing lovable losers about the Montreal Canadiens. No,
it's absolutely true. It is a bit shocking having grown up with them. But
yeah.
But that, you're looking at the jersey. The jersey, they've already gotten to that place where the jersey is more important than the face above it. The jersey is all that matters, and the jersey will always matter. But I do think there's something about a long streak of losing that's then followed by an improvement in winning that really drives people. And once you actually won, there's a release that I don't think you can get back to that point again. You can't keep building on winning unless, again, as I say, you're a dynasty. And that's very difficult to do in a salary cap era.
Very, very difficult to do. You're not enough of a student of the Montreal Canadiens to know that Mayor Jean Drapeau, after they won the Stanley Cup, used to put out statements that said the Stanley Cup parade will follow the usual route. So where are the NBA playoffs are going to be in Disneyland? Is that right?
That's the latest. They're negotiating with Disney World in Orlando.
Disney World in Florida. Okay.
Yeah.
And where will the NHL playoffs be? Have they decided that yet?
You pick them. A lot of different sites being talked about: Edmonton, Toronto, Columbus. I don't think it really matters. Obviously, people in Toronto will lose their minds if it's in Toronto because they'll feel like we have home ice advantage. I don't think it matters. You just need you need that cluster of hotels and a sealed environment around an arena, maybe with easy access to practice facilities. Toronto meets that measure. Edmonton meets it at a higher level, like it's basically a bubble downtown. So anywhere that they can bubble these guys and hope that they won't break quarantine. NHL players probably won't. And NBA players might be a little more. They're more rascally.
Right. Rascally. That's such a soft word for what you probably mean. Who has a better chance of winning their league this year, the Toronto Raptors or the Toronto Maple Leafs?
The Raptors. Oh, without doubt.
Raptors.
To my mind.
Why?
I think there is something, the sports world has been taken over by analytics, and analytics, of course, everybody will tell you is a great tool, and every team now has 100 guys crunching the numbers. But when you talk to GMs off the record, because they're afraid to talk about these things, and coaches, because they're afraid to talk about these things on the record lest they be labeled Luddites, they still put their faith in old school things like character, winning, a guy who knows how to win. And so, they're the experts, so I will defer to them, and the Raptors have won. So once you've won, you know how to win. You've gone through it once. The Leafs haven't come close to winning anything. So I think that's a very difficult hurdle to leap all at once. And, let's just, if you're the Leafs or the Canadiens, let's just win one series. Like, forget about the Stanley Cup. Like, just win one, and then maybe you can start talking about it. But the Raptors, I would think, would have an easy path to the Eastern Conference Finals, and then who knows?
So I'm a fairly casual basketball fan, and so this is not by any stretch an expert opinion. But I had the opinion for years when the Raptors were good but not great that you couldn't win an NBA championship unless you had one of the very best players in the world on your team. because the players spend so much time on the court that if, no matter how good a team you are, if one person out there is demonstrably better than anybody else, it's going to make a difference over time. And then they got one of the best players in the world, and indeed that good team became a great team and won. Now they don't have him. How is it possible that they're not worse without him? And how is it possible that they could win without one of the best players in the world on the court?
Well, I think the presumption here is that having lost Kawhi Leonard, and of course it's very difficult to say after nearly 3 months off, but that Pascal Siakam has become that player for them and will reveal himself in these playoffs as one of the best players in the world. Like, I mean, he's pretty close. He's a top 20, 25 player. He'd need to be probably a top 10 player for them to win it all. But yeah, like that's the presumption. If you're gonna guess that they're gonna win it, you're gonna be saying that Pascal Siakam gives them what Kawhi Leonard did in the previous playoffs.
Right.
So.
Why is there? We talk about politics a little bit on this show, Cathal, and so I'd like to mix the two for a second. Why is there more politics in sports in America than there is in sports in Canada? So I think of things like Colin Kaepernick and that whole movement, and periodically there are things that happen around there's the whole thing about I'm not going to go to see the president because it's Donald Trump, or it's these kinds of things. They're more political. You never hear hockey players say shit about politics. And it doesn't seem like it's welcome or part of the culture at all. And if it is a culture, it's a much more small C conservative political culture than the other sports leagues.
Well, you touch on the idea of hockey players going to see the prime minister. Well, hockey players don't need to go see the prime minister because that would presume a Canadian team had won the Stanley Cup, and that doesn't happen. So it's never going to be an issue. I would say, when you say there's more politics in their sports, I would say there's more politics in their politics than there are in ours. We just simply aren't as divisive. And I mean, as much as we try to ape them, I think in some of our rhetoric, we simply aren't that divided. We are not as much as we would like to think, we're on the cutting edge of things. And I do feel almost like we have to sometimes mimic their trends and talk about their problems as if they're also our problems, when I don't think they're really our problems. We don't have their same history. So I think you take it out of our daily lives. I don't think our political arguments are nearly as fractious as theirs, certainly not as corrosive and ugly as theirs. Certainly you get a bit of hate, but I think it's all in good. You've seen the way people have reacted to the Prime Minister during this and the Premier of Ontario. Like, there is a bit of a, rally around the leader when things are really bad that you do not get in the United States. So yeah, I don't think it bleeds into our sports for that same reason. I also think it's because athletes here, and I guess we're talking about the American athletes who play in Canada. They probably couldn't tell you what province they're in. And the Canadian athletes who play in Canada are like the rest of us. They don't care. And many of them live in the States. So I just think it's a difference in temperament that bleeds through the culture into sports.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about the culture of hockey?
Sure.
One is, over the years, we've learned an unfortunate amount about the amount of abuse that goes on of players when they're young in the minor leagues, and when they're in things like the WHL or the OHL, even in those kind of circumstances. And then last year we had the whole Mike Babcock coaching thing that spread throughout the league briefly as a wildfire about abusive coaching practices. Yep. Is that an abusive culture to be in, hockey in Canada?
Well, I think if you ask the average hockey player, elite, high-level hockey player, they'd say no. I think hockey is, and again, I don't want to speak from a level of, I didn't play the game at a high level, so I don't know. I didn't play any game at a high level, so I don't know. But just from observing from the outside, hockey is, of all the major sports, hockey is the most militaristic, in the sense of people feel is a top-down culture, that veterans get the say, rookies are to be abused. Everybody has to be broken down and built up into the unit of the team. Nobody is a personality. Nobody has their own personality. It's a very militaristic culture. And as we know, militaristic cultures are a abusive would be one word, incredibly hard, Spartan. They take great delight in physical punishment. Hockey is also about not so much delivering pain, but you see it in the way players talk about fighting. They don't delight in the idea of hurting someone else. What they delight in is the idea of being hurt and taking it, like being a man, not going down. And when they do, fair fight, and you struggle off the ice by yourself, no one ought to carry you, right? Like if you when was the last time you see a guys will go down and get, blow a knee and allow themselves to be carried off. But when you see a guy go down in a fight, it doesn't matter if his skull is shattered, he's going to get himself off the ice. So I think there is an element in hockey of masochism, and that's what's feeding into this. People enjoy it. Like when I talk to guys who played hockey at not just NHL, various levels, they delight in these stories. About being shoved into the bathroom of a touring bus and stripped naked and told to dress themselves. Like they love these stories. For them, that's one of the boys. I was one of the boys. That's how I got acceptance. I don't know if it's entirely healthy. I wouldn't want to do it. I'm sure you wouldn't either. But we didn't do it. So I'm not sure I'm willing to judge as much as people are that this culture needs to be destroyed because I don't understand it. And as long as the people who are taking part in it say that it brought them something, brought them closer to people, made them learn how to be, obviously changes can be made. People should not, the Akeem Alou situation should never happen. Like there are things about this that should not happen. There needs to be some change, but I'm not willing to say I think that the whole thing needs to be torn down.
What is it about that culture that rejects PK Subban?
Well, nobody likes to talk about that. It's very hard to get a handle on it in the sense of, is it because he's black? And then people will tell you up and down, it is not that. Well, then what is it? He's just too much to himself. He worries too much about himself. Like, the NHL needs more PK Subans. The NHL had a brain that said they clone PK Subban because they need about 50 of him to sell the game.
Right.
But the NHL hates the idea that anybody ought to think themselves any higher than anybody else. They want more Connor McDavids. And Connor McDavid, God bless him, if you've sat down with Connor McDavid, that's just the way Connor McDavid is. He's incredibly quiet, incredibly, like he just has, his personality is operating on a level where all he does is play hockey. And I think once he's not playing hockey, he switches off and just powers down and then goes back up. Subban is just up all the time. The NHL, I don't understand it because that's the guy they should be pointing at to say, this is the way we need, the Subbans and the Ovechkins, and name one other great player who's fun. I can't think of one, but this is a problem for the NHL. That's a business problem. You talk about a culture problem. That's a business problem. They need those guys.
Right, but then they say, well, he's not good in the locker room, right? He's not a good team guy. He's not. They come up with all these euphemisms basically for saying the guy's got an NBA attitude in a NHL league, right?
But I could see the problem if he was, your sixth defenseman, but, not so much lately, but there was a moment in which he would have said he was the most electric defenseman in the NHL. So, if the guys we're supposed to give certain leeway to players who work at the very highest level. And he's working at the very highest level. Why is he not allowed to do that? I don't know, but I haven't been in those locker rooms. And of course, nobody is willing to go on the record about things like that. That's too dangerous territory on a bunch of different levels. That's dangerous territory for them. So nobody will touch it. We may find out 10 years after he retires.
Okay. All right. Now, I know that you're not explicitly not a big follower of the Canadian Football League, but I do want to ask you this question.
Sure.
Which is the owners in the Canadian Football League are different from the owners in other sports leagues. They have no reasonable expectation of profit. They're either community-run teams or they are private owners who are essentially sports philanthropists who own the Toronto Argonauts or the Hamilton Tiger Cats or the Montreal Alouettes because they want there to be a Canadian Football League and they're prepared to lose some amount of money in the millions a year in which to do that.
Yeah.
Is there a different case for some sort of financial assistance to the Canadian Football League than there is for assistance to any other sports league in Canada?
I would say that it's the price tag that set people off, I think. It's when they said we need $150 million. $150 million sounds like an awful lot of money if you can afford to run a sports team. It sounds like an awful lot of money. And I think that's what upset people. Had they said we need $10 million, people would have said, well, yeah, sure. Okay. fine, $10 million.
Right.
Once you say 150, people want to know, well, who's getting paid? Are the Americans who are living here, are they getting paid? If the CFL is in such terrible danger, I don't think anybody would argue that it is as important a part of our cultural heritage as many arts organizations. Like, it's certainly more, I think the Saskatchewan Roughriders are more important to that community than the Toronto Symphony Orchestra is to Toronto. Yet, Toronto Symphony Orchestra, if there was a suggestion that it was going to go under, you can damn well be sure the government would step in and say, we're just going to take it over. That's something we're just going to run now. So my suggestion here would be, if you believe the CFL is in existential danger and is never coming back, why not essentially nationalize it? There could be some element of it, I don't know how they would work this, but some element where the government takes ownership, partial ownership of this thing, and says it's a cultural inheritance, like a museum piece. The same way that we would pay for the Art Gallery of Ontario to be open, we'll pay for the Saskatchewan Roughriders and the BC Lions to be open as well. I think that might catch some traction, because it gives people the idea that the government might make a few bucks off it, even if they won't.
You know what? We're heading toward the great socialist utopia. The government will own the sports teams, and then the government will pay the journalists, subsidize the journalists to cover it.
Now you're talking.
Now you're talking.
Calls, David. Yeah, make a few phone calls.
Listen, this has been a delight. What a great, fun conversation this was. I genuinely hope that you are back covering actual sporting activities soon. I don't hold out much hope for my Canadiens in this 24-team round-robin tournament, but we will see. And for people who are wondering why I was light on you today, why I didn't hold you accountable for things today, it's because you are related, you are a cousin of a woman named Una Kilkenny.
Yes.
And Una Kilkenny is A, one of my best friends, and B, her husband, Ray Martini, wrote and produced and recorded the Herle Burly theme song along with his and Una's son Liam. So Ray and Liam Martini are the Herle Burly theme song. So there you go. You are a charter member of the Herle Burly. Yeah, absolutely.
Pure nepotism. Cheers.
It was great talking. It was great talking with you and meeting you. Thanks.
Yeah, to you as well. Take care.
If we have learned anything over the past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ottawa's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. The only way to really get the detailed boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Here they are, my favorite co-panelists, Jenni Byrne, Scott Reid. We're back with the political panel this week. Welcome to both of you.
Hello.
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 Hello, hockey. We got our big Foster Hewitt microphones, right? Hello, hockey fans in Canada and across the United States and Newfoundland. I love these big Telus mics, man.
They're so good. They make me feel very professional. You're wearing one hell of an ugly shirt there. I want you to know that I'm wearing an outstanding shirt. It is a Saskatchewan Roughriders jersey with the number 25 on it, 25 being the great Rhett Dawson, who came to the Saskatchewan Roughriders in 1973 from the Minnesota Vikings and was the best receiver in the league for 3 years from 74 to 76 and was my favorite player. And on the field, after one game, did give me his chin strap off his helmet. So that's Rhett Dawson. You are Tales from the Crypt.
I am. It's a beautiful shirt, and it's a gorgeous Jack Davis cover. Jack Davis. In fact, I think I have a supersized. Let me see if I can put it on this. I'll piss you up. No, you can't see it very well. I have a supersized collection of Jack Davis's artwork.
I don't know what you're trying to show us, but it looks.
Well, I have up there, but you can't see it. A huge thing, like a supersized. Jack Davis was an artist for EC Comics, so I'm a big. those EC comics, that were banned and then they were burned by, angry parents in the 1950s. And I collect those old EC comics from 1950, 1954. I love them all. Tales from the Crypt is a fantastic comic and a fantastic legacy. So you fuck off.
All right. I'm fucked right off. Jenni, have you been down to Fenelon Falls recently?
I haven't, but I'm going down in a couple weeks. So I'm excited about that. So this is perfect.
Yeah, when's the last time you saw your folks?
I saw my dad and my stepmom about a month ago. So I'm looking forward to going down. Fishing season is opening. So I love to fish. So I'm going to get my rod and tackle box at my dad's and do some fishing.
Oh, I did.
Really? What do you catch?
Fish?
I prefer bass because I like to cast and
smallmouth. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I like to fish.
Is that a good eating fish?
Yeah.
I don't eat fish.
It's very good. It's very good. Smallmouth is nice. Easy to clean, tasty to eat.
Well, there you go.
Welcome back to Scuttlebutt Lodge.
Well, I'm the person that should be talking about fishing because I am nestled in the woods in rural Quebec at a lake. But you both live in Toronto, and Toronto opened up this weekend. And to some notoriety in Trinity Bellwoods, but I don't necessarily want to dwell on that. But I understand that life is moving in Toronto, that if you're out there, there's people in the streets, it looks busy, it looks like there's activity. So what's going on? What does it feel like? And how does it feel like to you to be living in Toronto right now?
Well, it feels much better than it has over the last 10 weeks. Weather was great this weekend. There are more stores open, although not fully open, which I think is it's going to be a sign for the economy opening up. I went with my best friend Lynette to the Toronto Outlet Mall in Milton, just west of the city, and only about 30% of the stores are open. And the experience with all of the rules and regulations that the government has put on reopening, I think it's very onerous for business owners, but it also makes shopping a very uncomfortable experience. We are two people that love to shop. We shop. It's one of you could call it a hobby of ours, and it wasn't a fun experience. So it'll be interesting to see if this could end up being like, retail was starting to wane to online buying. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the next 2 years. But
you've
generally,
got to believe that process has been accelerated.
For what?
Of retail going to online.
I think the last
bricks and mortar retail.
I think the last 10 weeks have probably accelerated.
But don't you think that's happening? I'm not convinced that it's happening culturally. Like, I don't think it's because suddenly people say, hey, you know what? We can make as much business doing it this way, and this may be the wise time to make the transition. I think it's going to happen because businesses have been crippled by this. Mm-hmm. Businesses don't have the ability to reopen. Rents have become a train wreck. I think if there's two or three areas, I think, where all governments have really failed. One of them, from a business perspective, is surely the rent policy. It's just been it's been the most toothless tiger, ineffective program I can imagine, and I think it's really having a huge impact on the retail sector and will. But I don't want to. Like, I don't know when it will happen. I don't know when it's safe and all that stuff. But I'm not going to be just shop on my computer. I don't really like to shop, but if I'm going to buy, I look good in jeans, right? Like, I look fucking good in jeans. And so when I want jeans, I'm going to buy jeans. I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, hey, Heather, can you bring in the Jordashes, please? And I want to try on 6 or 7 pairs, see which just happen to shape over me. And so I don't want to do that online. You can't do that online. So yes, it will be accelerated, but I don't think people are going to dismiss retail experience. But I think for the time being, as I said, it's made for an uncomfortable experience. So we went to a shoe store. I got a pair of shoes from the owner, and I went to sit on the bench. It was a big 6 foot long bench. There was someone way at the other far end, and he's like, no, you can't sit down. And I'm like, why? And he's like, well, there can only be one person on the bench. And I said, but the other person is like 5 feet away from me. Like, it's that big of a bench. And he said, it's the government rules. And the next thing you know, you took out your Guy Fawkes mask and you said, fuck it. And you just started smashing over things.
No, I didn't. I felt bad for the guy. And also it was very busy in the store, like, relatively speaking. Like, it was there was a lineup, but like there were people, his employees were scrambling around, and he said, I only got 5 employees here. And I said, did you have a hard time getting people back because they've applied for the CERB and they're getting more money? And he said, no, with government regulations, we're only allowed a certain amount. So I think that I hope, I'm with you, Scott. I like to go into a store. I like to shop. But I think that for the time being right now, it's made for an uncomfortable shopping experience for people like us that like to go into the store.
But Christ,
it should be reassuring for Scott that now that you've moved into those elastic waists, you can buy those jeans online, Scott, without any real concern.
Yeah, but you got to watch the zippers on those things. You can have some terrible calamities. I hear all that, but I mean, I don't think, frankly, I worry about the businesses. Being inconvenienced in the shopping experience and all that stuff. I mean, it's a small price to pay. I mean, to me, we've talked about this. It's what's the path forward? Like, I don't think there's any effective communication. And I'm not just shitting on politicians, but I don't think there's any effective communication as to, what the boundaries on this playing field are. What's going to happen? How does it happen? In what sequence? And in particular, and I've mentioned this before, like I find it frustrating. We see the cases in Ontario rising. I don't know if they're rising because those are just test results that are happening at a rate that didn't before. I don't know if it's happening because there's more testing. More cases happening. I know that there's substantial numbers in Toronto, as an example. Like we're at a high peak in Toronto. We're actually the reopening is now coinciding in Toronto with the highest number of cases that we've had since this thing began. And so you go, well, so is the government going to say at some point, sorry, the concentration of cases is too great, we're going to have to roll back some of these reopening measures? Did they not? What's the guidelines on this stuff?
But Scott, I'd like to point out the cases are high, but the numbers that no one is paying attention to are the actual hospitalization and ICU numbers. So although the cases are at where they in the 400s, it was 404 that was announced.
That's in Ontario, not just Toronto, though. Toronto is higher.
That's in Ontario, but 404. There are only 818 hospitalizations, 148 ICUs, and 104 ventilators, which has been the lowest level, which ultimately, if you remember, we've talked about this, the reason we went into a lockdown mode was to flatten the curve so hospitals would not be overwhelmed. And hospitals are not overwhelmed. This is so the numbers, everyone's focusing on the case numbers, but what they should be focusing on is in terms of the hospitalization numbers.
Yes, in one respect, but I'm not certain that's the only perspective. I mean, at what point are there no...
But that's why we locked down. Like the reason politicians put in the lockdown measures was to ensure the curve was flattened. The curve has been flattened, and in fact, the hospitalization has been decreased, has gone down, which is the reason. And it goes to what we have talked about before: is at what cost is it having, and not just the economy, but in terms of other healthcare procedures. There is no hospital in the province right now that is doing any elective surgeries. None.
I understand all that. Before we move on to all the other consequences of it in terms of the healthcare, so it's indisputable that the stress that was feared has not occurred in terms of the healthcare system. But if cases continue to increase and you get this clustering of cases, say, for example, in Toronto, and you saw Ford yesterday being Monday, blundering in a press conference talking about hot zones and then sort of hinting at what they are, and then public health officials saying, well, we shouldn't necessarily identify what the hot zones are and are not. And you get this clustering of cases. I think the number to watch is mortality rates. Because you're right, the whole public dialogue around flattening the curve is about not stressing out the system. But if we start to see mortality rates increase, I think that it will freak people out, and they will say, look, maybe it's not stressing out the system. Maybe it does a broader good at some point in terms of herd immunity. But if people start dying in larger numbers, I think people are going to say, hey, we got to react to that. And I don't think people will shrug their shoulders and say, oh, but she was 80, so who gives a shit? I think there are people.
So let's narrow this down. Wait a second. Let's narrow this down a little bit. It's a big topic. This, as near as I can tell from the most recent cases and deaths report, this issue, wave one, is over in Canada, except for Ontario and Quebec.
Yeah.
Right? Ontario and Quebec are still hotspots. They're trending back up. They're, in a kind of a worrisome situation. But in every other part of the country, COVID is gone. It's over. And those places have got to be, if I'm reading from you in Toronto, Jenni, people in those places have got to be desperate for a full opening of their economies. But how does the federal government, do you deal with that kind of dissonance? And, you're talking about travel and we're talking about borders and all that stuff. How do you deal with the fact that in central Canada, you got this thing still raging, and in Western and Atlantic Canada, it's gone?
Well, it never really peaked in Western or Atlantic Canada, and this is the argument. Did we ever really see a full first wave? We've had two centers, Ontario, predominantly Toronto, a bit in Ottawa, and Montreal, where there have been rampant outbreaks, mostly within long-term care facilities. I'm not saying there hasn't been community spread, but it's mostly been in long-term care facilities. And it appears that both governments are attempting or have now seemingly got that under control. In terms of opening up the borders, it's basically Trudeau has let, in terms of like cross-border provincial, Trudeau has let provinces in terms of make all the decisions in terms of opening up and what have you. So I think that for him, he's sitting back and waiting to see what to do in terms of opening up the actual borders. But it's going to ultimately depend on what the Americans do. It's not like if the Americans open up the border to non-essential travel, eventually we are going to as well. And if you look, you see more and more European countries, Spain, Italy, they're actually going to, as of July 1st, not even have the quarantine requirement for tourists that come in. France in 2 weeks is going to be opening up their border to Germany. So we're starting to see more an opening all around.
It doesn't this
Scott,
highlight?
If you were the premier of Manitoba, would you put some restrictions on travel from Ontario?
There are restrictions for travel in Ontario. I was just up in Thunder Bay. I took my family up to Thunder Bay, and they're going to stay there for a while, outside of Thunder Bay, actually, up closer to Dryden. And there are restrictions in terms of going across from there to if you're traveling from Dryden over to the Manitoba border. So I think there are restrictions. I think there are. I think they're pretty soft, but I think that there are restrictions. By the way, if you want to take a 16-hour drive with no place to stop to take a leak, now's the time to go. Dynamite time. Super duper fun trip. I took a piss. I got on the side of the highway somewhere between Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay and taking a leak. And I looked over and I shit you not, there was a bear on the other side of the road walking around to the ditch. And, I think to myself, bears are. And there
you were marking your territory.
Right. And you go, well, say bears are more scared of you than you are of them. But I'm thinking to myself, I don't know. My combined bear knowledge is pretty thin. And if I get it wrong, he's going to swat and knock my old lad off. I'm getting back in the car fast. So, it doesn't. Isn't the unsatisfactory fact about all of this discussion around reopening, around the public health implications, stress on the healthcare system, or the absolute stress on the population? It all comes down to testing and tracing, and the fact that we don't have it in place. And that's where I think we're seeing an increasing amount. You've asked, David, what's it like in Toronto? Well, the daily news conferences for Ford have gotten a lot rockier because every day Ford goes to the microphone. He says, God damn it, I want to see more testing and tracing. And people are like, okay, it was nice to hear you were on our side and thinking about that too for a few days. But now's the time to quit saying that you're frustrated that it isn't there and tell us what's it going to take to get it there. And I'm not putting all this on him because I don't think that's fair. But worldwide, the testing and tracing, it's the key, because then we can say, all right, well, we know where the cases are rising. And, Heather Schofield has such a great column today in the Toronto Star where she says, this reopening is haphazard. It's not thought through. It's not rational. We should have testing and tracing in place for this to be possible. We should be thinking about a hyper-local approach. We should not talking about Toronto writ large, but rather parts of it. And certainly not worrying about Manitoba and Saskatchewan and asking them to follow suit. And we should be talking about whether we need certain sectors opening in a different sequence. And I just don't think there's been a very thoughtful, mature, rational approach to opening. I think it's been more driven by, Jesus, people have had enough and we got to open up. But it's how do we do that in a way that works, that doesn't spark a public health crisis again, and that actually saves as many businesses as possible?
Well, how is it the case that the governments haven't entirely pissed away this lockdown period? And that, while we were all locked in and hopefully preparing for an opening scenario in which there would be testing and tracing, Jenni, in which there would be a logical approach to reopening. But Scott is, whether one supports reopening or doesn't support reopening, Scott is fundamentally right that we just decided to reopen. It's not like we had a set of preconditions. We said, we'll open when we meet these. We did have those, but we haven't met them, and we're just opening anyway. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we've talked a lot about the accountability that will come to governments from long-term care and the crisis in long-term care homes. But they have generally pooched this, I think, now, this part of it, the reopening.
Well, I think we're going on week 11, and so I agree, and I've been very open in terms of I am supportive of the opening. I don't disagree that there hasn't really been a plan in terms of opening, but in terms of, you see here in Toronto, in terms of people that I talk to, that ship has sailed, and so the government's got to do catch up in terms of, and I agree, track and trace, increase the testing. And increase the testing numbers. But I think what we've seen this weekend and what we see with people is they're just not willing to go back to what it was 8 weeks ago. It is just not on the table. So the expectation is going to be even greater, Scott, to your point, on government. So the leeway that all governments have been given over the last 11 weeks, they're not going to get that from people anymore. So people are going to be like, all right, if you want to do X, you have to explain to us why it works. You can't just say it's because, listen to us, we're all a big team and we're all in this together. There has to be rational reasons. And that's why you see people, you saw what, the 10,000 people at Trinity Bellwoods. And I heard that there was 5,000 people at Christie Park, I guess it was on Sunday. I didn't even know Trinity Bellwoods was a big hangout place. I've only been in Toronto for 4 years. I live mostly in the East End. So I didn't realize it, but I think that, for people, if who've been waiting for answers, if you live in a 400 square foot apartment and you don't have air conditioning and you've lost your job and you don't have a Muskoka cottage like John Tory, and you don't have a car to get out of the city, and it's the nicest day of the year, going out and sitting in a park is about the best possible thing that you can do.
I understand all that, but it doesn't square with something. And maybe that is a concrete reality, and the something I'm going to raise is an abstract reality. But public opinion polling still shows, and Dave, you're the expert in this area, so you can explain it to me maybe. It still shows that some of the assumptions you just baked into your comments, Jenni, are not valid. Like it still shows that people are driven most of all by anxiety about public health, and that if there's evidence of a threat to public health, that they want that to be the priority over reopening, over economic considerations. And so people go, wow, the sun is out and I've had enough and I want to go into the park and pee there and drink in public and stand next to a stranger. But on the other hand, if you ask them, they say, no, I want to make sure that public health is driving this. And so how do those things square? And again, like if cases start to rise, what's going to happen? Is government going to yank the leash, and will people go yes, or do people say no, or what happens?
There is no chance that they can put the genie back in the bottle. And I guess I would say if people are concerned, there's almost zero evidence of transmission from out to door, like community transmission from people outside. That's one. There's almost 0%. But second, if people are concerned, and then they stay home. I think that we're getting to the point where people can make their own choices. So, it was great. You have talk radio on, you hear a lot of commentary, people sitting in their cottages going, oh, did you see those kids at Trinity Bellwoods? Oh, how irresponsible was that? Or they're sitting in like big backyards. That's realistically not how it is. And there's other arguments to be made. Okay, so let's say restaurants and bars were open so people could actually have gone this weekend and sat on a patio, and restaurants and bars it was up to them. It was their responsibility to make sure that it was at 50% capacity. It would have given people an avenue legally to go and sit and have a beer with their friends and enjoy the sunshine. So I guess where I'm saying right now is you've got to give people the choice. There is no evidence right now, you've got the cases, but that the hospitalization is ultimately the reason we were in lockdown. Lockdown was not constructed to keep the cases down. It was to keep hospital visits down. So the system wouldn't be overwhelmed. So governments cannot move the goalpost right now after health officials and governments told us the reason we were doing this in March 17th, was because we wanted to make sure there wasn't stress to the system. There has been nowhere near stress to the system.
But not everything is a class war, right? It isn't just, and every time you sort of passingly make reference to people who are concerned as assholes who are sitting in their fancy cottages. But, it's possible that there are people that are not of that ilk who are still concerned. And I go back to it. You're right with respect to the rationale for flattening the curve. It was supposed to be avoiding massive stress on the healthcare system. But there's still an objective reality, which is that if infection rates increase in a substantial way in a clustered area like, say, Toronto, or even something more local, that's going to be concerning to some people. And if that leads, and I don't know that this has happened, and it's not happening yet, but if it starts to lead to an uptick in mortality rates, then there will be some public demand for action and rollback and anxiety. It will trigger anxiety if mortality rates start to increase in the city of Toronto. But so what does government do at that point? You're just saying,
but it's a hypothetical. We're talking hypothetical. So we could sit here.
Well, I have to contemplate it if I'm making government policy. I have to contemplate that situation.
And and governments have had 11 weeks to do it. But you also have to factor in everything that we have talked about. If you see right now, if there was doctors that came out in California over the weekend, I'm not sure if you've seen, there have been more suicide attempts in Northern California in the last 4 weeks than normally happen in one full year. And 600 doctors have written to Trump about how the isolation and the lockdown is so adversely affecting people's mental health and well-being, and how addictions are up. These factors have to be part of the discussion.
But aren't they?
Okay, I'm calling a halt to this. I'm calling a halt to this because it'll go on forever. But I want to ask you both the same question. Jenni, 6 friends of yours that you haven't seen since the beginning of this are gathering for drinks inside at a restaurant or a bar. Would you join them?
Yes.
Hey, Scott, would you?
Sure. You're talking about in a month or two from now when they've said that you can start doing that?
No, I'm talking about right now.
Probably not. Probably
Today.
not.
I would.
So Jenni, you're not afraid of this virus, and Scott, you are somewhat afraid of this virus.
No, I am cautious. Would I have gone to Trinity Bellwoods on Saturday? No, but I probably wouldn't have gone whether there was COVID or not. I think people have to be, am I going to go and kiss strangers or that kind of stuff? Absolutely not. But I think, 6 friends sitting around a table.
David's not a stranger.
6 friends sitting around a table and having drinks 3 feet apart from each other. It's completely low risk, and I would have no problem with it. If restaurants were open this afternoon, I would be there.
Yeah, I guess that's an honest answer to your question too. If I want to, if restaurants have been permitted to be open, and if they're with people I know, but I know I'm going to be contemplating a measure of risk. I don't necessarily feel it, although I probably should because I've got some lung infection issues and respiratory issues. But gosh, it's just I keep coming back to it. If these cases increase, at what point do we say, hey, man, I love walking around this coal mine, but fuck, all these canaries look dead to me. And don't we go, whoa, hang on.
It's going to be interesting. I want to fuck off on COVID and talk about a couple other things, but my last COVID related question is the Trudeau government announced, was it yesterday or I'm losing track of the days, but announced that they would try to implement a mandatory sick day policy across the country, giving people, I think, 10 sick days or something like that to mean that they didn't have to go back to work 10 days. The NDP are claiming credit for this announcement. It's something that Jagmeet Singh had been talking about and calling for, and they say that they persuaded the Liberals to do it. They also claim some credit for the raising of the wage subsidy from 10 to 75% and for the existence of the CERB. And just from what you're hearing and what you know, and also your experience with minorities, do you think the NDP are playing a significantly influential role right now on policy?
Listen, I think these are measures that Trudeau wanted to bring in himself. I think that Jagmeet Singh can be claiming credit for it. But let's see if it actually happens. The mandatory 10 sick days seems like a ridiculously not thought out policy. I think the Liberals may have thrown him a bone on that, but let's see if it actually passes. It's just something. It's another measure that we're giving to small businesses and businesses that they're going to have to eat in terms of this. So okay, everyone, you've been either laid off or you've been working from home for the last 11 weeks, and now we're going to give you 10 mandatory paid sick days. It is just another knock to businesses that are already in dire straits right now.
I think that this is a horse trading play that we're mistaking for a policy play. So, I mean, what's really happened here? So I do think Jagmeet Singh deserves some credit on it. And I think that the Liberals, I'm not quite where Jenni is. I don't think that they wanted to do it all along and they didn't do it. If they had, they would have. I think that they're comfortable with this policy. I think this policy resonates with them and they're very comfortable with it. But they've been steering a very careful course when it comes to provincial interactions. This is a flat out incursion, right? Saying we'd like you to change your policies in this way. And they're doing it because they needed Singh's support in terms of how they want to construct parliament as a hybrid parliament, not as compared to what the Conservatives are supporting. So that's what triggered this. It's that they had them in a minority situation by the short ones, and so they're able to push on it. It's a policy they're willing to accept. Jenni's point about will we see it implemented is a good one, and that's where I think the politics get even more interesting, because I think that if the provinces make the mistake of fighting on this hill, they won't like the fight. Because this policy is going to be broadly positive, or broadly popular, and so I just think if you're the provinces, you got to be careful. I'd make a nominal, symbolic objection now and say, hang on, if we want to do this, and you've got to work with us to make this happen, and then I would demand cash from the feds and say, if we're going to implement this policy, then you've got to flow a check to us, and that's the price for the agreement you got out of the NDP because of your problem in the House of Commons. But I would not fight this thing hammer and nail if I were a provincial premier. I would demand cash and get out of the fight because I don't think it's the boxing ring they want to be in.
Well, it's certainly a lot more sick days than was aggressively fought by the small business community in the Wynne labor reforms. More paid sick days than was in that's for sure. There
are millions and millions of Canadians out of work, and all levels of government have been spending like boatloads of money. Like I don't know if the feds just have a giant money tree out back at Harrington Lake that they can just start pulling stuff off, but there actually has to be some thought now given to this, and this is just I do not think you will see this implemented at all.
All right. Fuck COVID. That's enough COVID. We're going to talk some other politics now. And as a transition point, it's my book of the week. And hopefully Scott isn't going to try to match me or trump me this week, but it is called Discipline of Power by Jeffrey Simpson. The Conservative Interlude and the Liberal Restoration. This book is about the defeat of the Trudeau government by Joe Clark in 1979, the brief Clark government, and then the defeat of the Clark government in the House, and then on the hustings by the Trudeau government. First of all, look at this fresh-faced Jeff Simpson. Holy lifting. Look at that guy.
He got a mustache
this
in that
book
picture?
was one of... Oh, yes, he does. Oh, yes, he does. He's fresh off of being a New Democrat. People might not know this, but Jeff Simpson worked for Ed Broadbent. Jeff Simpson started off as a New Democrat. And there's a passage in this book I'm just going to read because it made a friend of ours famous, and it's such a great story. This is the day of the vote in the House of Commons in which the Clark government was brought down. Nancy Jameson awoke early Thursday morning. She hurried down to Parliament Hill for a 7:30 breakfast meeting with middle-ranking staff from Clark's office in a private dining room adjacent to the parliamentary dining room. Neville turned to Jameson and asked her to outline the parliamentary timetable for the period until Christmas. I think you're a little premature, she replied. She explained to her startled audience that she now believed the government would probably be defeated that night. Throughout Wednesday, Jameson had been observing the disturbing signs from the opposition parties. Maybe the Liberals were serious after all. On Wednesday night, Jameson made several other calls and satisfied herself that the government was headed for defeat. No one at the breakfast table believed her. Her warning was treated as a minor joke, an excessively skittish reaction to a tight but manageable parliamentary crisis. And so ends the Joe Clark government. Thank you for a great book, Jeff Simpson. One of the major thesis of this book essentially is that the Conservative Party is an unwieldy coalition that does not have the discipline within itself that power, the pursuit of power, brings to the Liberal Party. And at the time that he wrote this, the Conservatives had been through 2 decades of division and warring between different factions. Either of you read that book?
You bet.
No.
I love that book. It's a great book. I won't talk about any other books, David. I don't want to upset you, but I love that book.
No other books. Okay, Jeff Simpson, thank you very much. So as we talk about COVID every week.
Wait. Before you leave that, I want to ask Jenni a question because I think that's a pretty interesting observation. Jenni, the Conservative Party the modern Conservative Party is a different party than he was talking about, Jeff Simpson in his book.
Yep.
But are we seeing that through the Harper years, it was the discipline of power and it was exerted through him as an individual saying, guys, let's get our shit together. Let's do a merger. Let's focus on defeating the Liberals, winning power, and then maintaining power. And could you make the argument, you tell me if I'm right or wrong in this, and that since his departure, that discipline has been missing. The leadership discipline of him and that focus, and we're seeing a more factionalized party that is working hard to defeat itself now.
No, I don't think it's factionalized. If you look, we have seats, like the party has seats from coast to coast. So it's not a party of it's not the coalition. It's not like the Socreds or Reform or what have you. I think that Stephen Harper was obviously merged the party with Peter MacKay, was the first leader, was prime minister for 9 years, and built the party. It's the modern day party of Stephen Harper. I think that unfortunately over the last few years we had a leadership race, and it wasn't as exciting. So it would be the same as the years that you guys elected Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff. Sometimes you have a leader that just cannot fill a vacuum or does not command the respect that is needed to be disciplined, to create the policy, to be able to communicate to Canadians properly.
Okay. The prospect of winning is generally pretty disciplining. And so, one of the best things you can do to maintain discipline over your party and your caucus is to look like you're strong electorally and going to get reelected. I don't know if Scheer ever managed to pull that off either.
Well, I think a lot of people, we started the pod leading up to the last election, and there was a lot of people within the media, even chattering class people like us, and within, I know, my party, that were convinced they had a real shot at winning that election. I think there were people within our campaign, our national campaign on election night, that thought they were going in and they were going to at least win a minority.
So Joe Clark's defeat in '79 must have been, one of the most backbreaking things you can go through, because it was almost entirely self-inflicted. And he had he was 40 years old, and he had his hands on the prime ministership. He seemingly never looked back from that. He marched forward. He tried to continue on as leader. He ran for the leadership again. He served as a cabinet minister. He came back into politics. He's not damaged by this. When I was a young guy working for Ralph Goodale in Saskatchewan, we were organizing down in the Souris Moose Mountain part of the province, southeast part of the province, and there had been a tremendous candidate for the Liberal Party there in 1979 who'd been recruited in 77 when the Liberals were at 50% post-Levesque and people thought they were going to sweep the country. And this guy was an unusually strong candidate for the Liberal Party to have attracted in a rural area. He was a big rancher, and he'd been Citizen of the Year in his municipality a number of times, and he was one of the big wheels in that area. And he got smoked in the election because he was running for the Liberal Party. And he got smoked. And then he got smoked not only in the riding, he got smoked in his hometown. And he moved. Sold his ranch, uprooted his whole life, and left. Because he knew that most of the people in that town, whom he'd all counted on as his friends and colleagues in his community, had not voted for him. And he couldn't handle that. So defeat drove this guy right out of his pre-existing life. And so there's a lot of different ways in which people can handle the grief of losing in politics. And I'm not sure most people who've not put their name on a ballot really understand what it's like to put your name on a ballot and lose like that. This is, of course, all prompted by former Prime Minister Harper's the interview from 2018 that came out this week. I don't think it's very interesting to rehash the arguments he made about why the 2015 election was lost, because frankly, I don't think they're very interesting arguments, and I don't think that most people who analyze their own defeats come up with very interesting arguments about what happened. But that whole thing led me to think about the fact that he's still trying to process that, still trying to justify what happened in 2015, 3 years later. What do you have? Either of you have any insights into what it is that really, how people manage and deal with political defeat?
Well, I think to your point, none of us unless you put your name on a ballot, it's hard to fully comprehend how people feel in terms of a loss. We've all lost campaigns, and it's varying degrees of devastating. I think I was in politics for like 5 years before I actually even had a win. So I got kind of used to that. Knocking on doors in Etobicoke by-elections for like the Reform Party was not the easiest of experiences. But I think that probably different people handle things differently. I know we kind of touched on this when we did the pod live from the pilot, and I think that in terms of Prime Minister Harper, I think you're looking at a very snippet of an interview that was, over 2 years old, where he was talking about he was of course promoting his book and talking about a certain media bias that all conservatives, every conservative I know, feels there is slightly of a bias, and just little things. Well, the fact that we're even talking about it now in terms of the Prime Minister's intentions, no one talks about former Liberals in terms of that as much. And I think that if you ask specific examples for conservatives, look at could you imagine a conservative leader groping a woman and it only being like a 2-day news story, or a conservative leader wearing blackface several times and it only being a 3-day news story? There was less coverage on that than what there was on Andrew's citizenship, which what my opinion on it is, but it's still it's not comparison. And even if we look at what Bob was saying last week in terms of controlling, you've heard media, not publicly, also privately, probably to all of us, say this Prime Minister's office is actually the most controlling, centralized Prime Minister's office that they have seen. Although if one were to do media commentary or one were to listen to the commentary, you would think it was actually Stephen Harper who trusted his cabinet ministers and who had fulsome discussions and they had full responsibility. So I think that in terms of the interview, which is I know where you were going at, I think that he was encapsulating what conservatives think, but I think you were looking at a very small snippet. But the fact the media still care about what he's saying 2.5 years later kind of says something.
But the fact that I agree it does. And it's an interesting phenomenon in itself, the specter of Harper lurking phenomenon. But it also says something that 3 years after the election, he's talking about the defeat, and he's talking about the campaign, and he's talking about how he was treated, which,
well, I guess
I'm making. I'm not picking him out. I'm saying I don't believe these people ever get past this. Right? Just because Paul doesn't talk about it doesn't mean he's past it. I think these things are earth-shattering experiences for people, and they never really ever get past them. Scott.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I won't even bother with the Harper thing specifically. I mean, I this whole media bias thing, I tend to be dismissive of, to be candid. And sure, lots of media are biased in various ways, but I don't think that's, look, these people really put themselves out there, right? I mean, it's the reason why people always go, well, hey, aren't you interested in running for politics? I was never interested in running for politics. For the same reason that I've never really been interested in standing up on a stage and doing stand-up comedy. For the same reason I don't take my shirt off in public, right? I fear rejection. I can't handle the personal rejection of the rancher that you were just talking about, right? Of the guy who says, fuck, I got to leave town now because I can't look at my neighbors knowing that they had the option to be supportive of me and they made a personal judgment to not do so. And I think that does carry with you. And defeat is tough. I wrote a column once. And I used to write a column for the Ottawa Citizen. And I wrote a column one time after the 2015 election about losing. And it wasn't about who won, who lost. It was just about that bile-inducing, grind you down process after you've lost of what you go through. And I don't think I ever had a bigger reaction to a column. I had conservatives, liberals, New Democrats, all sorts of people writing me personal notes saying, thanks, I went through that. It really touched me. And I know that when we lost in 2006, after a decade-long project or decade and a half long project, I basically, I spent the days, smoking cigarettes and cleaning my pistol. It was just a bad fucking time. And I think it's only natural that a political leader would ruminate on it, and when asked about it, would fail to be objective about it, and would look for things to blame it on, because you got to rationalize a very heavy personal rejection, and it's hard to reconcile yourself to that. So I thought, in a weird way, there's lots of things that can be said about that Stephen Harper interview. I thought in a weird way it made him more relatable than ever, right? There's a pinch of Nixon in there. Sure, I don't like all that. But there's also look, he's a human, actually. Turns out that the guy, he's got the same burn in his gut left after that defeat that I had after 2006.
People should know that Scott has in his basement a poster of all the prime ministers of Canada and their tenures in office, and it's hanging on his wall, and it ends with Paul. And so it's like Paul Martin, 2003, ... So in Scott's world, in Scott's house, Paul was never defeated. He remains the prime minister.
And I sit in my Mrs. Havisham dress and I rock back and forth. Imagine the world as I prefer it.
I want to ask you folks, we in a couple of podcasts ago, we were talking about the sky high ratings that all the leaders have. And in some cases, that's reflected in vote intention. In other cases, it's not quite reflected in vote intention. But in almost all cases, the leaders have extraordinarily high ratings for their handling of the scandal, historically high ratings for their handling of the scandal. Greg Lyle was saying this week, several governments in Canada have never, that jurisdiction, no government's ever been more approved of than the current government.
Like Chavez level.
Yeah. It's Chavez levels.
Yeah.
How much of this can we blame on the House of Commons not sitting? How much of this is the fact that whatever the accountability mechanisms are with the daily news conferences and the journalists asking politicians questions, that the governments are coming out of those sessions looking far better to people than they ever come out of a House of Commons question period?
Well, listen, I think there's been, I would put this in two spots. I would put kind of March, April in one, and then I think kind of May, like now onwards. I think that all politicians seem to have been getting a very, I'm not going to say free ride, but they've been given the benefit of the doubt in terms of their handling of COVID, and in terms of their handling, be it economically, be it track and trace. They've been given the benefit of the doubt. There are times I watch press conferences for all the premiers. I have it on in the background, and for Trudeau, and I'm sitting there going, well, why don't you ask this, or why don't you ask this? And that's not what he said last week, kind of thing. And so I think that there has been, because of the public health angle and because of people's concern on that, there has been a hesitation by the media to actually be too forceful with politicians. I think that is starting to change. I think as we kind of transition back into some form of normalcy, I think you're going to see politicians be given less of the benefit of the doubt, because we're going into month 3. So one could forgive a politician for being flat-footed a month and a half ago or a month ago. It's becoming less and less likely to do that. In terms of a month ago, I think having the accountability sessions in the House of Commons were less important. But as we transition in, I think it is important that the government be held to account. I think it's important for the opposition to be able to have a regular avenue for debate, because we are talking about massive amounts of money. We're going to eventually be talking about border reopenings. We're going to be talking about, working with provinces in terms of, interprovincial, borders being, because right now the borders are shut, but that's actually unconstitutional. And the government's kind of letting provinces decide what they want. So I think it's very important that there be regular question period. People are starting to go back to work. People are starting to go back to their regular days. There is absolutely no reason that Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government cannot be having question period and committee hearings live. There is none.
There's got to be some phenomenon here, because, speaking bluntly, none of the Legault, Ford, or Trudeau governments deserve the sky-high approval ratings that they've gotten. There's lots of chinks in their armor. They've all made lots of mistakes through this. There's lots of issues that they could be really in trouble over. They're not. And so are we finding out, Scott, that the House of Commons is a different kind of accountability mechanism than anything else, really?
I think my fundamental answer to your question is no. I think you're wrong. I don't agree with it, and it doesn't mean I do. I mean, if the premise is, it's because the House of Commons isn't sitting that we're not seeing these leaders tested more, that we're not seeing lower numbers. I don't think so. I don't think it's at the feet of the media. I don't think they've failed in their responsibilities. I mean, maybe some have, I don't know. But I don't think that's the phenomenon that's going on. I think the phenomenon that's going on is, people ask themselves two core questions when they look at a politician. Do you get it? And are you properly motivated? And those questions are complicated when we're talking about differences of opinion in a routine time. Should taxes go up or taxes go down? Do you get it? Are you properly motivated? And then people make all kinds of decisions. In a moment like this crisis in March and April, almost every premier, every politician in Canada was demonstrating that, yeah, I get it. There's a public health crisis, and that's the only thing that concerns me. Are you properly motivated? Yes, I am. I'm working day and night to focus on that. Maybe I make good judgments, maybe I make bad judgments, but I'm doing that. And for most people, that was good enough. And that gets you the sky-high approval rating. And it's got nothing to do with whether the Commons is sitting or whether it's a reporter or a critic asking the question. I believe the House of Commons, we at minimum need a hybrid parliament. I do believe the House of Commons is vitally important. And I think there's lots of sins that get passed in the absence of committee work and all that sort of stuff. So I do think all that's important. And I don't put them as either ors, but I think that's the explanation for the phenomenon. And one of my points of proof would be that not everybody has done great. Trump has not done great. His numbers have been bad. And one of the reasons that his numbers have been bad is that for a long time, he signaled that he didn't get it, that he didn't really believe it, that he was inconsistent on whether there was a problem or there wasn't. And he hardly ever appeared to be properly motivated. He seemed almost entirely motivated by his own self-interest and his own political interest. He didn't sound like Doug Ford or like Legault or like Trudeau. And I think that explains the gap.
But I think this goes back to our conversation last week in terms of, we're talking about kind of tone and tenor. As we transition into the summer and as we transition into the fall, is it going to be the hearts or minds? And so you have we talked about it's the hearts are the are the Justin Trudeau's and Doug Ford's, and they're like, I'm with you, buddies. Like, you know, I've got your back. We're all in this together. And then you have more of technical. Legault, whose numbers are high, he's been more technical. Like he's sitting there and like going through numbers himself and taking technical questions. And so I think that we're going to see then which approach. Right now, the hearts and minds have kind of, for lack of a better term, won the day in terms of leading the coverage or what people want to see. I think people want to see less and less as you know, the 4 months, you know, that they're eligible for CERB are starting to wane, and now they're thinking about how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to pay my bills? You've got parents who have to figure out what they're going to do over the course of the summer, because in a lot of cases, they're not going to be able to have their kids go in day camp, and that actually prevents them from going back to work. Like there's a lot of stress that people have, and I think you're going to see a transition from the style of politics. People are going to be expecting more than just the fluffy stuff, I guess, so to speak.
Agree 100%. It'll be real fast. My way of agreeing that would be to say that I think there are now questions being asked of politicians beyond do you get it and are you properly motivated? As we move into the reopening, you've got to answer other questions, meet other tests, and it's going to be a lot harder.
Well, I'm anxious for question periods where people get to hold Trudeau's feet to the fire about the wage subsidy, and people get to hold Ford's feet to the fire and Legault's feet to the fire about long-term care, and get some real answers out of these things. I think that's where we need to be at. Thank you very much, both of you. So great to talk to you. Love our weekly get-togethers here. Scott, come on, Scott, give us a smile, for Christ's sake. Yeah.
The Johnny LaRue. It's great to be here. Great to be here. Thanks.
I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for this. I want to thank Cathal Kelly for coming on. I want to thank everybody for listening, the Air Quotes Media team for putting this on. I want to thank Matt Naslund for the 1986 Grey Cup.
Woohoo!
Woo!
Little Viking.
the little Viking. And I want to end this show because in honor of Cathal Kelly, I want to end this show with a slightly extended run of the dulcet tones and beautiful groove of Ray Martini. See you next week, folks.